World War I is often forgotten or an afterthought by most average citizens. It was an unglamorous war that few families in Europe were unaffected by. For the most part, there are no heroic figures. One person that fits the mold of a heroic figure was T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence was educated at Oxford and became an architect. Lawrence's war story is very different than the majority of other British soldiers in World War I. Instead of spending his time in the trenches, avoiding shellings and gas attacks, Lawrence's story is one of camels, dangerous desert terrain, and guerrilla warfare. The British Army employed Lawrence to start and lead an Arab revolt by employing guerrilla warfare tactics to take over cities and to destroy Turkish supply lines. T.E. Lawrence's use of guerrilla warfare and impressive skills in negotiation helped the British win World War I. Guerrilla warfare is as old as warfare itself. The idea that a small nation, tribe, or army could stand toe-to-toe with a world superpower and beat them in battle is not very realistic. Large armies have immense advantages in both weapons and intelligence, as well as in people and in resources. For a small foe to attempt to engage a much larger foe in regular combat would be suicide. In the case of the Arab revolt during World War I, that mighty foe was the Ottoman Turks. The Turks had long held power over the Arab peoples in the Middle East. In 1914, the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, reached out to Lord Kitchener of the British Army to gauge his interests in negotiations to revolt against the Turks. After the Ottoman Empire joined forces with Germany in World War I, the negotiations escalated. High-ranking officials for both the French and British armies met in the Kingdom of Hijaz to outline the future revolt. Along with the royal family and important military strategists, there was also a young British architect by the name of Thomas Edward Lawrence. Lawrence was brought in because of his knowledge of the terrain and his ability to quickly gain the trust of those he works with. Lawrence had the trust of his own superiors, but that was not the trust he needed to gain if he was to be successful. Lawrence needed to earn the trust of the Arabs, and more specifically high-ranking Arabs. This would not be an easy task. Despite the Arab tribes all revolting for the same cause, they were not united peoples. Each tribe had its own leader, many worshipped different religions, and oftentimes these tribes were enemies of each other. Lawrence needed the help of a prince to gain the trust of the Arab people. Of Hussein's 4 sons, Abdullah, Zaid, Faisal, and Ali, Lawrence found Faisal to be the best of his liking. Faisal was more sophisticated in the ways of the West, and he trusted Lawrence entirely. Once Lawrence earned the trust of the royal family, he needed to earn the trust of his men in the battlefield. The deserts were often their battlefield, more specifically strategic points along the Hejaz Railway. Bedouin lifestyle is difficult. This is not a situation where Lawrence and his men could fight a battle and then return to home. They would be forced to live a mobile lifestyle in the desert. That meant eating, drinking, sleeping, and bathing in the desert. Bedouins navigate by the stars. They find water under rocks in the desert, and they carry their tents they sleep in wherever they go. Transportation meant either walking or riding a camel. This was a difficult and rigorous lifestyle. Lawrence earned instant respect from his men by being incredibly durable under these harsh conditions. Lawrence was quickly amassing an army of substantial size. One way that Lawrence earned the respect and loyalty of important tribal chiefs was to offer them sums of gold. He also offered gold and weapons to mercenary soldiers to keep the interest in the war high. He turned that interest into a type of Arab patriotism that would only continue to boom as victories were won. In what Lawrence described as a war of detachment, he employed guerrilla warfare tactics to force the Turks to exhaust their troops as widely spread as possible. One key element of guerrilla warfare is to strike at the moment that was equally the most opportune moment for you and the least opportune moment for your enemy. This is where Lawrence excelled. A good amount of the Arab revolt took place along the Hejaz Railway. Instead of attacking major cities, which Lawrence understood to be a risky endeavor, the Arabs spent much of their time destroying sections of the rail line and looting the destroyed trains. This accomplished 2 things that would ultimately doom the Turks. The first of which is that it served to cut off supply lines. Even the small skirmishes that did little other than harm the tracks would set back supply lines and would restrict the flow of foodstuffs and necessary materials to the fronts and to the major cities. The second thing that it accomplished was that it forced the Turks to spread its army along the rail line to prevent destruction. While a sound theory, this tilted the advantage to Lawrence and his troops by creating smaller concentrations of enemy soldiers to fight at one time. Railways were not the only place that Lawrence and his troops fought. After the success in 1916 of fighting along the railway, the revolt began to take ground from the Turks. By January of 1917, half of the Turkish troops were dispersed along the Hejaz Railway, trying to keep it from further destruction. The other half were in Medina. Throughout the remainder of the war, the Turks were forced to be on the defensive. The Arabs continued to take ground until the peace came. The final battle of Lawrence's time in Arabia may have been the one that he is the most lauded for, even though that is probably somewhat undeserved. The town of Aqaba was the last port city that the Turks held. Lawrence took off for Aqaba with himself, 33 camelmen, and a chief by the name of Auda. Over the course of the 200-mile journey, the group picked up over 500 more tribesmen through bribery with gold. When the attack on Aqaba began, Lawrence mistakenly shot his own mount and was rendered unconscious when the camel landed on top of him. When he had regained consciousness, the battle had been won, and the Arabs could now join up with the imperial army. At the end of the revolt, the Arabs had either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner 35,000 Turkish soldiers at little loss to their own forces. On top of the large number of casualties, the Arabs had taken 100,000 square miles of the enemy's territory. With the war coming to an end, Lawrence now was faced with the unpleasant duty of serving as translator to Prince Faisal at the Paris Peace Conference. He had hoped to make Prince Faisal the king of Syria, but in the end Syria was awarded to the French. Lawrence returned to England a hero of the war and was quickly complimented by Winston Churchill with an appointment to the position of advisor to help construct a pro-Arab Middle East. It wasn't until the Cairo Conference of March of 1921 that Faisal became the leader of Iraq and his brother Abdullah became the king of Transjordan. One reason that T.E. Lawrence was so lauded as a hero is perhaps that his story alters so much from the stories of other World War I soldiers and leaders. Stories from the trenches were often ugly and depressing. Lawrence's story is very exciting. Lawrence's exciting story is often forgotten in the broader memory of World War I, but make no mistake, without T.E. Lawrence's skill in guerrilla warfare and negotiation, Britain's success in World War I may have been very different.